Good morning. Welcome to our worship service here at the Parish Church of Christ. Today is the first official day of fall. It feels like it. Got some very pretty weather for which to be thankful to God. The leaves will be changing soon. Always enjoy seeing that. It always reminds me of the statement that one of our former mission team members made. He said, driving through the hills and seeing all the different colors on the hillside during the fall made him think of a bowl of Fruity Pebbles. And he could just picture God reaching down and scooping up a handful of it and eating it. I thank God would prefer something a little more substantive for breakfast, but that was Eric's view of the changing of the leaves. James chapter 3. If you would turn to that passage, page 1012, if you want to use the Bible in the pew. Several years ago, during the Watergate scandal, the president of the University of Minnesota spoke to the graduating class of Notre Dame. And he commented that just about all of the people involved in the Watergate scandal were graduates of our Ivy League, so-called Ivy League schools, Harvard University and so forth. And he asked the question, where did we go wrong? And then he answered his own question. He said, the sad fact is that there is no moral guidance anywhere in our public schools, from kindergarten to high school. Now remember, he's making this statement in the 1970s, early 70s. The fear of contamination by religion is so great that there is no place in our schools for teaching what is right or wrong. He's the president of a public supported university, or he was at that time. He would be fired today if a president of a public university were to make such a statement. But it's a good question. Where do we get moral wisdom? Just a couple of weeks ago, in the context of the situation going on in Syria right now, Secretary of State John Kerry said that, referring to President Bashar al-Assad's killing 1,429, I believe, people in his own country with chemical weapons, he called it a moral obscenity. I think we would agree with it. The question is, who defines what is moral? On what basis can he call it immoral if somebody else, if al-Assad is the one who did it, if he says it is not immoral? Who's to decide? Who defines what is moral? That is always the question that atheists have a hard time answering. Personally, I don't know why it is a moral obscenity to kill 1,400 with chemical weapons, and it's not a moral obscenity to kill 100,000 Syrians with traditional weapons. But be that as it may, where do we get wisdom? James answers the question in James chapter 3. And this is where I want us to spend our time this morning. In our interpersonal relationships, not the relationship between the president and his people, but our interpersonal relationships with our spouse, with our children, with our employer or our employees, with our school teachers. What does wisdom look like? Now, James begins by posing the question in verse 13. Who is wise among you? Now, from one standpoint, we might say that the book of James is about wisdom. If you look back at chapter 1 and verse 5, early on in James' letter, he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. And so from one perspective, we might look at the whole book of James, or the whole letter of James, as being about wisdom. James chapter 3, specifically, is about wisdom relative to the use of the tongue. Now, I think James wrote his letter to me meekness of wisdom is a Hebrew expression that means meek wisdom. It's putting two ideas together to form one. Let him show through his meek wisdom that he has wisdom and understanding. Meekness is defined as power under control. And Jesus has in all of these characteristics, Jesus is the perfect example of what meekness means, power under control. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, you remember, Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And Jesus tells him to put the sword back into his place. He says, do you not know that I can call 12 legions of angels? That's power. But he chose not to. That's meekness. Power is the ability to do something negative towards someone, but then choose not to do it. That's meekness. That is power under control. And so here in this discussion about the God kind of wisdom, James says that it begins with meekness. It begins with having yourself under control. And maybe that's why James describes wisdom in verse 17. And verse 17 is where we're going to spend most of our time this morning. Maybe that's why James puts this discussion of wisdom in the context of how to control your tongue. Because it comes back to that idea of self-control. So specifically, I want us to look at this description of the God kind of wisdom from verse 17. And James uses 8 words here to describe wisdom, and we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at each one of these 8. What does moral wisdom look like? What does wisdom look like, and how do I apply it in my life? Notice, first of all, that James says that this wisdom is from above. Now, James tells us back in chapter 1, verse 5 again, that if we need wisdom, we ask God for it, and God will give us wisdom. So this wisdom is from above. This wisdom is God in action. And so for each one of these 8 characteristics of wisdom that James mentions in verse 17, I want us to consider an example of that from the life of Jesus, and then I want us to suggest a way that we can put that aspect of wisdom into work in our lives, in our interpersonal relationships. So first of all, James says that God kind of wisdom is pure. What does that mean? That means that it's not mixed with anything that is impure. It means that it's not mixed with anything that is from the earth, anything that is self-centered, anything that is self-righteous, anything that is focused on me. It is pure, coming from God. Now that means that before we get to wisdom being peaceable, and that's a second characteristic, it means first of all, I am devoted to what God has to say. That's pure wisdom. That means that in my interpersonal relationships, I do not sacrifice my conviction relative to the Word of God in order to have peace. Wisdom has to begin with my focus being on what God has to say. That's pure wisdom. And I use it as an example from the life of Jesus, a discussion that he had with the Jews in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, Jesus asked the Jews, he said, "Why are you trying to kill me?" The Jews said, "If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." And Jesus said, "I have presented to you a number of good works from the Father, and these testify of me." In other words, Jesus says, "I told you that I'm from the Father." John chapter 6, for example, he says, "I'm the bread sent from heaven." And then he fed 5,000 people miraculously in order to prove that he was the bread sent from heaven. So his works prove that he was from God. So he says, "For which one of these good works from the Father do you want to stone me?" So Jesus was putting himself out there on the line, putting himself in danger. But he would not sacrifice his convictions relative to the truth. And so when you and I look at living a wise life today, in our actions at home and at work, we need to remind ourselves, first of all, what is God's expectations of it? What does Jesus say about how I am to conduct myself? That needs to be our first concern. Rather than reacting to what the world does to us, what Satan does to us through other people perhaps, we need to act towards them as Jesus wants us to do. So we need to always be concerned first and foremost, what does the Word of God have to say? A man was speaking one time defending the Christian faith. And a man came up to him afterwards and he said, I believe you Christians are all brainwashed. And the man says, well, I think that we're all brainwashed to some extent. It's just that Christians choose what to wash our brains with. Where is your fundamental conviction? If we want to live a wise life, then our fundamental conviction has to be pure. That means it has to be, first of all, defined by the Word of God. Second of all, James says, wisdom is peaceable. Wisdom is peaceable. That means that in all of our relationships, we do our best to keep peace. That means that when I get into an altercation with my boss at work, the first thing I want to do is to understand the situation from his or her perspective. And when I try to do that, or I get into a disagreement with my spouse, the first thing I try to do is look at it from her perspective or his perspective, then the conflict is automatically going to de-escalate. It means I am not going to try to win the argument first. It means I'm going to first try to understand their perspective on the arguments. That is a wisdom that is peaceable. Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. Jesus' own disciples were arguing about who was the greatest. You remember what Jesus did. He took a little child and brought him or her into the middle of the discussion, the middle of the argument. And Jesus says, unless you are converted and become like this little child, humble, peaceable, you cannot go to heaven. Wisdom is, second of all, James says, it is peaceable. Now, there are obviously times when we can't have peace. Some people just don't want peace. But there are things we can do to try to have peace, and that's what James is talking about. The hippopotamus fell in love with a butterfly. What an awful predicament to be in. So the hippopotamus went to the wise man. He says, I've fallen in love with this butterfly. What can I do about it? And the wise man says, well, give me some time. I'll think about it. So he took an hour. Hippopotamus comes back to him, and the wise man says, here's what you need to do. You need to turn yourself into a butterfly. The hippopotamus was so happy that he had a solution to his problem. He went away, dancing like you see hippopotamuses do. But then he stopped and thought, I don't know how to turn myself into a butterfly. So he went back to the wise man, and he said, how do I turn myself into a butterfly? The wise man said, that's not my problem. I just make policy. Now, there are some things that we have no control over. And we can't control how somebody responds to us. But James says the second characteristic of moral wisdom is that it is